What's a rocket docket?
A rocket docket is a specialized process that we can use here to put a lot of cases into the judicial process efficiently and quickly.
This would be judges who are sitting on this and determining whether they are going to, is commute the right word, commute their fines into community service?
Convert.
Convert. Yeah. And it would be judges.
Right. So the idea here is that we would set up a specialized court process called a rocket docket to fulfill the promise of Amendment 4. So after returning citizens have completed the terms of their sentence and probation and paid restitution so that we can make victims whole or as whole as possible, then we can look to helping those returning citizens transition back into society by regaining the right to vote, as Floridians overwhelmingly voted for.
This is not getting rid of the restitution that was imposed by a judge.
Correct. What we're looking to do has nothing to do with restitution. We are focused on after restitution has been paid, or for cases where there was no restitution in the first place, because we want to make sure that victims have been fully compensated. But once they have been, then we can turn our attention to making sure that we're helping these returning citizens get their rights to vote back as the amendment contemplates.
You're talking court fines and fees.
Exactly.
And those can amount to hundreds, thousands.
Yeah, the court fines and fees stack up over time. Their administrative fees and even a few $100s can turn into a few $1,000s over a period of time. What we're trying to avoid here is having two classes of citizens, people who can afford the right to vote and people who can't afford the right to vote. So the idea is for people who are in financial hardship, once they've completed the terms of their sentence and paid restitution, if we can convert those fines and fees to community service, then the community gets something from it, and we're fulfilling the promise of Amendment 4 to those citizens to have them get the right to vote back.
The ACLU has called this a poll tax, but when these court fines and fees were imposed, this was part of the punishment.
The court fines and fees are part of the normal judicial process here. The problem is that we've been funding our judicial system and our court system on the backs of the people who come through it, which is probably not a very good long-term approach. But the reality is that now that we have these fines and fees imposed on people, what do we do to remove obstacles to help facilitate people's transition back into the community and do it in a way that's not discriminating against people because of an inability to pay?
Is it fair if I can afford court fines and fees to pay those and someone else can't, that I pay those and then they have their community service or they have their fees converted?
What we want to make sure that we're doing is not discriminating against people based on an inability to pay.
Or an ability to pay.
Well, there are certain people, for example, who can afford to provide for a lawyer. And if you have the ability to pay for a lawyer, you do. But under the Constitution, if you don't have the ability to pay for a lawyer, the state will provide one for you. It's a similar situation here. The clerk's office collects fewer than 3% of all fines and fees. So right now the community is getting nothing from these fines and fees except hanging it over people's heads that make it harder for them to return as law-abiding, tax-paying citizens. Now we can convert, for those individuals in financial hardship, we convert those fines and fees to community service where they're actually benefiting the community en route to regaining the right to vote.
Still, we're losing hundreds of millions of dollars that would help fund the judicial system, the court system here in Hillsborough County.
Well, the process that we are discussing here has nothing to do with the fines and fees that wouldn't be collected. We're talking about people who have an inability to pay.
Who would never pay to begin with?
That's correct. Right now, we collect, again, such a small percentage of fines and fees in the system because the system is just set up in a way to keep levying those fines and fees on people who never end up paying them.
I know that Hillsborough County is among other counties in the state that are considering the rocket docket, and there's a lot to consider when it comes to this. How do you define a low-level offender?
We're focused on offenses where there's no restitution and no victims. So traffic offenses and drug offenses, possession cases, are going to be the two biggest categories of people who, once they've completed those terms, and they don't owe any restitution and there's no victim to be made whole, if they have fines and fees that can be converted to community service, that's our focus.
Talking about that, let's talk about DUI, because we have repeat DUI offenders who often drive DUI, they're convicted, then they're caught again, their license is suspended, the court fines and court fees keep mounting up, which is why they cannot have their license restored. Would that be a low-level offender who would have those fees commuted?
Well, that's not the types of cases that we're looking at. We're looking much more at the drug possession cases and the suspension of driving with a suspended license. DUI is a huge problem in our community. I mean, we're doing everything we can to fight DUI up front to make sure that we're protecting our roads, our citizens, to keep safe drivers out there, and to take people who are driving under the influence off the road.
Is someone in your office going to have to go case by case by case by case to identify who would qualify for a rocket docket?
The problem right now is the legislature passed a law that provides this great avenue for clemency for people to convert those fines and fees to community service, but there's no real infrastructure for us to do it. So that's why it falls to the locality, and that's why we've been working with the local stakeholders to figure out the best way to move this process forward. We think we're going to be able to find data to help us identify the people who fit the rocket docket, and we're also going to allow people to self-identify, to raise their hand and say, hey, I qualify here, can I be a part of this as well? We want to include as many people as possible who fit the profile so that we can actually implement Amendment 4 in a way that Floridians intended.
How would you ensure that someone wouldn't get before a rocket docket in Hillsborough County, be cleared, be given that right, restored that right to vote, but then also still owe fines and fees in another county?
That's a great question. Because we don't have the infrastructure here, we need to make sure that we are looking not just in Hillsborough County, but talking with legislative agencies, government agencies in Tallahassee as well. This is why there's a lot of nuance and complexity to the process, because there's no easy way to find this data, which is why we're working with stakeholders locally and in Tallahassee to make sure that we are following the law.
Are you pushing for a state database?
Right now, we're not. Right now, our focus is on doing everything we can to move this process forward, as the voters said when they passed Amendment 4, and as the legislature gave us a pathway to do.
Is this all political?
This is about what's best for our community. We talk about criminal justice in the context of holding offenders accountable, reducing recidivism, supporting victims, and helping people transition back to our community. This is that fourth piece of it. We're helping offenders transition back into our community. Studies show that people who regain the right to vote are less likely to reoffend. This becomes a public safety issue as well as a fairness issue, and most importantly, it's the law in Florida. It's our obligation to follow it.
In Hillsborough County, do you have an idea roughly of how many felons potentially could have their rights restored if these court fines and fees were not in the way?
We don't. We don't have an idea right now of what the numbers are, which is why we're looking at the data, talking with the clerk of the court and the Department of Corrections in Tallahassee. We think it could be thousands of people.
Tens of thousands? I mean...
It's hard to speculate because
Right.
we don't know what the data set is yet.
You know, when all of this happened, when this constitutional amendment was put forward and we were on the news talking, the number that kept coming up was 1 million. Roughly 1 million felons could have the right to vote restored. 1 million is a lot, and that could really sway an election, especially as we approach 2020.
Yeah, again, the numbers are what they are. And across the state, that's the number that's been thrown out. Our focus is nothing to do but moving the Amendment 4 process forward here in Hillsborough County, and we hope that other jurisdictions look at what we've done as a standard and a path to actually implementing Amendment 4.
Speaking with judges, I'm sure you have, what has been their response? I know that you've spoken with commissioners and councilmen, but what about judges?
So we've spoken with the chief judge about the plan. Obviously, any judicial process would have to run through the courts here. And the chief judge has been on board with the idea that this is a way that we can implement Amendment 4 effectively, fairly, and consistent with the law.
Right now, a proposal, but when would we have something like this in place?
We're working quickly, but this is a really complicated process. Getting the data, as Courtney, you've asked about, how do we identify the people, is really the biggest issue right now. With an election a year and a half out, we're hoping to have something done by the end of the year so that we can maximize the number of people who can take advantage of this process to be eligible to vote in 2020 and going forward.
When they hear fees and fines, they think restitution, and restitution is very much part of punishment.
And restitution is different than the fines and fees that the court imposes. I mean, this whole process operates outside of restitution. Restitution has to be paid first. I was one of the early supporters of the Victims' Rights Amendment to the Constitution that guarantees full payment of restitution to victims. So this is in no way stepping on the rights of victims. It's coming after victims have been fully paid, or if there were no victims in the first place.